Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. First of all, some news. As Cather announced at the end of last episode, she's stepping back from the podcast. But excitingly, we have a new host, who's Eleanor Halls, who's with me now. She will talk a bit more about her background and what she'll be doing on the show at the end. But for now, she'll tell you a bit about this week's guest, who is the biographer Hermione Lee.
So Hermione Lee spoke about her career as an English academic, as well as her working on her biographies of Henry James and Virginia Woolf, among many others. And she also touched on the reputation of biography as a genre and kind of the misconceptions around that genre.
It was a really fascinating interview that I did up in Oxford, and we hope you enjoy the show. So I'm here in Oxford with Hermione Lee, very kindly welcomed us into her home. Hermione, could you tell me a little bit about your early life and where your interest in writing first developed?
Yes, I grew up in London in the 50s and 60s and went to London schools.
And your father was a doctor? Right?
Yes, my father, who's still alive at 96, is a retired GP. He was a general practitioner in central London. He was also a very good amateur cellist.
Okay.
And my mother, who was pretty much self-educated, was one of the widest read people I've ever met. And so I had a astonishingly privileged and cultured middle-class London childhood, going to operas and concerts and plays and ballet and art galleries and reading non-stop. We didn't have a television. So most of my life between the age of sort of 8 and 17 when I went to Oxford was spent reading books when I wasn't living my life.
And I was reading the essay you sent me on reading in bed. Did that have sort of shades of your... I should explain that. Where that was your initial lecture?
So reading in bed was what they call the inaugural lecture at Oxford. When you get a chair at any university, actually, mostly you have to sort of display why you've been appointed, and you give what's called an inaugural lecture. And mine was given in 1999, which was a year after I'd arrived, and it was called Reading in Bed, and it was deliberately angled at women, the history of women writers and readers, because I was the first woman to hold the Goldsmiths Chair at Oxford, so I thought I should make a point of that. And it was very much about horizontal reading, sort of reading the
under the covers
women do under the covers, or in secret places, or early in their life, and often young women readers who didn't have the kind of encouragement that I had, which was that I didn't have to read in secret. It would have been frowned on if I hadn't been reading.
Right.
Whereas there are quite a lot of women who talk about the fact that they had to battle to find their reading time. So yes, I was reading all over the house, on holiday, upright in bed, in armchairs, around the family table. It was a reading household. And
then you come and you study English at Oxford, and do you decide that you want to go on an academic route fairly early? How does that decision come about?
I never think of my life. I admire people who make tremendously clear decisions about their life early on, but also rather frightens me. I feel I've sort of fallen into things, really. I actually wanted to be an actor. Okay. For a long time. A lot of academics who were thwarted thespians. So yes, I went to Oxford. I read English in the mid-60s. I stayed on and I didn't do a DPhil or PhD. I did a 2-year graduate degree because I was very eager to sort of go and earn a living and make my way. So then I got a 1-year post in an American university.
In Virginia, was this?
In Virginia, College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, which is a very extraordinary place. And this was a Woodrow...
Is that Colonial Williamsburg?
Yeah, that's Colonial Williamsburg, which is remarkable, sort of a kind of imitation or spruced up 17th century village, really. And you would be teaching in the Wren building, as it was called, and ladies in imitation 17th century dress would come in to see Thomas Jefferson's desk while you were reading. So it was an amazing place because it was full of craftspeople, actually. It was full of art workers, people who were doing the thatching and the weaving, and so I met a lot of extraordinary people. And I cut my teeth on, big American classes. I was teaching sophomore survey course and a freshman introduction, so I really had to, having done no teaching before except a few graduate supervisions here. So yes, I think I decided within my 5 years as a student here in the 60s that I wanted to just go on having something to do with literature and teaching. But I don't remember a point where I sat down and said, I am going to be an academic for the rest of my life.
And what were your areas of focus with your early academic study? Were you looking at biography at that stage?
No, not at all, really. And I think in the 60s you didn't very much.
Yeah.
It wasn't at all a academic subject, and thereby hangs a tale, I think, that sort of standoff in a way between academic mainstream teaching and biography. It's taken a long time for that to change, I think. No, I was tremendously interested in mainly, I think, 19th and 20th century literature, and mainly, though not exclusively, novels, and a lot of women writers, though again not exclusively so.
And where, more generally, have you seen writing with a capital W, your own writing, fitting in with an academic career? How have those, and particularly writing for a broader audience, how have those strands evolved?
Well, I didn't do a PhD. I did a book on Virginia Woolf. I did a book that came out in 1977 called The Novels of Virginia Woolf. So I suppose that would have been my thesis.
And PhDs were less of a prerequisite at
I
that
was
stage.
the last. I got in just under the door. I think I was the last of the generation that could get an academic career without having got a doctorate. I'm sort of slightly embarrassed about this now. I've got some honorary doctorates now to make up for it. But I certainly couldn't have done that now. And I suppose right from the beginning, without articulating it, but I suppose what I've always wanted to do was teach and write about literature and talk about it in the public realm, on radio or television or wherever, or in reviews, in the same voice. I've never really believed in a sort of technical specialist language for literary criticism or literary analysis, and I think I completely missed the boat in terms of sort of structural theory, and it wasn't for me. I suppose I'm an old-fashioned liberal humanist, and that increasingly drew me towards interest in the relationship between the lives of writers and what they're doing, because in the 60s and 70s
it's the opposite idea, right?
Yeah, there was a kind of very strong. There was a strong line of the death of the author, as it were, sort of deconstruction and structuralism, whereby the idea that you married or found a direct line between the life of the author and the work of the author was seen to be a sort of rather conservative bourgeois sentimental concept, I think. I mean, a lot of this is coming out of France, and a lot of it is coming out of high modernism, actually. Those people like, the great high modernists like Yeats and Eliot.
I mean, I've often thought as well,
who, by the way, were very keen on separating the author from the work.
I mean, the thing I often think about the death of the author is that if the author is dead, then the critic is king, right? Because then, it is a sort of grandiose thing for literary criticism as activity.
Yes, I'm not knocking it because it's just a school of thought that I don't share, but it certainly means that the analysis and the critic's control over the work can be dominant, yes, because you don't have to bother about soft old concepts like intentionality.
And have you, in terms of, you say, not having a specialised language for talking about literature, have you ever faced resistance in the academy for plain speaking, as it were?
No, I've been very lucky and I have nothing to complain of. I think that the tussle for me, and it wasn't a very major tussle, was trying to persuade people when I came back here to Oxford after 30 years away from this particular institution, that biography and life writing were teachable subjects. And there certainly was a bit of leftover resistance there. There was a sense that it wasn't serious enough, or that you couldn't, how could you get your teeth into a messy, impure form like biography in the way that you could get your teeth into Paradise Lost?
Right, okay. And your movements then, how long, you're at William and Mary, and then where do you move to?
Yeah, so I did 5 years at Oxford in the second half of the 60s, and then I went to America the very beginning of the 70s. It was a very interesting time politically also to be in America. And then I came back, and that was the time when there were lots of jobs. There were lots of academic jobs.
Because of expansion of higher education?
Yeah, golden age, really. So I got a job at Liverpool, and I spent most of the 70s in Liverpool, which was fantastic. I had the most wonderful time there, in all kinds of ways. And then I got a job at York, and I was at York University for just over 20 years.
And when we've had other academics on the show, but how have you been able to combine your teaching and your responsibilities within the institution with your own writing around that?
Well, I think you've got to be quite organised.
Okay.
And I think you've got to be... I thought certain things have to be sacrificed, actually.
Yeah.
So I think there have been phases in my life where I'd have liked to be gallivanting around a bit more, or be a bit more social, or be a bit more open house than I have been. Because, if you're trying to write books and reviews, and at one stage do television programmes, and teach, and also do a certain amount of administration, then you've got a very full package. But I think I lived a very free, rich life as an academic compared with some of the things that are going on now.
I was going to ask, have expectations
I think it's
changed?
much harder. I think I had a much freer timetable and a greater ability to fit things around what I needed and wanted to do. And I see, mid-career or young academics now who are wrestling with a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of grant applications, a lot of administration work, and I fear for them because I want them to write their books.
Yeah. And when is your first venture into writing biography yourself? So you write the book on Virginia Woolf, which is criticism.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the Philip Roth book, which is...
That's a tiny little book which I did in a series that the late Malcolm Bradbury edited at a time when people in England didn't know all so much about contemporary American literature.
It was the first book on Roth in England, right?
It was the first book on Roth in England, actually, yeah. And that led to a long kind of working relationship with him, because I did the Parish Review interview with him, and I used to read for him. I was one of the group of people that he would send the sort of penultimate draft to.
So this is, 15 years post Port Noise or something like that? How?
Yes, he was in the middle of the Zuckerman books. Yeah. It was the early 80s.
And how bigger name in American culture was he at that
huge.
Stage?
Yeah, huge.
Yeah.
I mean, the fame of Portnoy was what, in a way,
inspired
the Zuckerman books.
Right.
How do you deal with that? As astonishing global fame.
Yeah.
Oh no, huge, and big here too. But I think people weren't. He wasn't a household name quite in the way that he became here. But so that wasn't biographical really at all. I wrote a book on Elizabeth Bowen, who I'm a great admirer of. That had some biographical aspects to it, and I wrote a book on the American novelist Willa Cather, which I suppose was the first book that developed some more thinking about the relationship between the life story and the work.
Yeah. I mean, I was reading the Against Biography passage that you sent, which I thought was very interesting about how there's a notion that we have of biography as a kind of stentorian, earnest art, and actually it is. It's quite grubby in some cases. It's like or quite journalistic, or as you say, like what's that pithy line you have, like dragging the awkward sequence of the famous dead out, or something like that. I mean that I find a really fascinating tension. But I suppose coming from a journalistic background, I wonder, is it about distance? Because if ultimately, if you're writing about someone who's 100 years old, everyone's dead. Ultimately, no one can sue. Like it's sort of different from, I suppose, what say Tom Bower does or something like that.
Yeah.
The big doorstopper.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of different questions.
I suppose how grubby is it would be my question.
So the thing you refer to is a chapter, a little tiny chapter called Against Biography, which is part of a a book called Biography, which was published in the series that Oxford University Press does called Very Short Introductions. And the idea is you sum up everything about a subject in 30,000 words.
These are the very colourful books. Right?
Yeah, they've got nice colour, rather Rothko-ish colour-coded covers. And they fit into your pocket. And they're meant to be a useful introduction to. I use them all the time. Yeah. And it's hard, actually. They're quite hard books to write because, you think it's going to be a doddle, and actually compressing down everything you know about something you know quite a lot about is quite tricky. So I thought it was important in there to give the attack on biography as part of the subject. And as you're saying, part of the attack on biography, and it's always been the case, is that it's squalid, it's grubby, it's voyeuristic. From Henry James to Janet Malcolm to Germaine Greer, people use the image of ransackers or burglars or people coming in and pulling out the drawers and throwing all the underwear out of the drawers. And there's often, frequently, especially by creative writers, attacks on biographers as pretending to be tremendously earnest and high-minded and writing all these footnotes and so on, and really all they're after is the scandal and the gossip. And B, grotesquely simplifying the work of the writer if the writer is, say, a playwright or a novelist or a poet by reducing it all down to the material of their life. And I think readers of biography, and there are lots, have very mixed motives in that you can be...
They look like serious books, right?
Well, but you can be... It depends who it's about, of course, but you can be on the same page, really genuinely interested in whether this life can give you an example of how to live your life, which is a good, interesting motive for biography, or telling you about something you knew nothing about, but at the same time you do want to know, who they went to bed with and why and all that. I mean, I think we're all made up of very mixed motives all the time in terms of how we respond to input.
And where do you regard the beginning of modern biography? Is it the big Victorian three-decker, or do you see a...
Oh no, I think it comes before then with something like John Aubrey's brief lives in the 17th century, or even actually you can place it much earlier with Plutarch's Lives of the Greeks and Romans, where you get these marvellous scandalous stories of people rising to great power and then dropping off the cliff, and often warnings. But I think the thing really changes in the 18th century with Boswell's Life of Johnson, where you get a sort of democratisation of the genre. So a form that was supposed to be about the powerful, the outstanding, the saints, the martyrs, the heroes, the rulers, becomes about, a lexicographer, for goodness sake. I mean, the most famous English biography is about this rather bad-mannered, smelly, uncouth, troubled English man of letters. Yeah. It's a very unlikely biographical hero, and it's a very, very wonderful book because, as Boswell says, I want to do warts and all. I want to do the whole thing. I'm not going to pull my punches. And I think that's where the form we recognise is beginning. And in a way, the kind you mentioned, which is the big 3-volume 19th century Victorian Life and Letters, in a way, that's sometimes a kind of aberration because it's so much more of a monument, so much less of a living article than what came before that in the 18th century or early 19th century. And what I think you now have, which is, well, we can talk more about this, but biography is a much more flexible form, I think.
Is Lytton Strachey another kind of turning point there? I mean, I read Eminent Victorians last year and was slightly underwhelmed, actually. Like, I thought he hadn't done that much research.
Yes. Well, no, that's part of the point, really. He's... and
it wasn't as rude as I hoped it was going to be either.
I know what you mean. It's 1918. Yeah. Okay, so it's 100 years ago. And it's very much...
We should say this is Eminent Victorians by Lytton Strachey.
Yes.
Instead of the reader.
It's 4 potted lives of 4 famous Victorians who include Cardinal Manning and Thomas Arnold, who was a headmaster of, rugby, and Florence Nightingale.
And Gordon of Khartoum, right?
And Gordon of Khartoum. And what it's doing, I mean, it's slightly difficult to see now why it was so important, because one of the things it's doing is cocking a snook at that kind of venerating hagiographies, sort of turning famous people into saints, as it were, and whitewashing their failings. And because the models are long gone, nobody's reading the original lives of those people. The parodic spirit of it has sort of disappeared, and we can't quite get it. The other thing, of course, is that Strachey was one of the early takers up of Freud.
Right.
And so he also wrote A Life of Queen Victoria, which is sort of Freudian analysis of Queen Victoria, which is very interesting actually for the time. So that kind of way of making these big heroic figures somehow susceptible to repression and anxiety and neurosis was a very interesting turning point. And again, it's really hard for us to see how telling that was at the time, because we're used to it. And also, yes, you're quite right. He appears to be quite sort of gung ho with his.
The bibliography is like 6 books, right?
No.
It's not.
Well, that whole thing about footnotes and bibliography, that's quite a recent thing, really. It never happened in the 19th century. You never have biographies with footnotes then. This whole idea we got to verify all our sources because we're so nervous about someone saying, hey, they didn't say that. That's a 20th century phenomenon, actually.
Yeah. And coming back slightly to the notion of the ransacking, I mean, is there a different skill set required? In that, perhaps to explain between being a kind of literary academic and being a biographer, and to explain the book I've just finished, which is about the army. I had a visiting fellowship up here at the Changing Character of War programme for a year, and was interested. I had come at that from a journalistic background where I was very used to banging on people's doors and the sort of hustle piece, which I felt that was I had never spent time in archives or anything like that, but I knew how to run down a lead and all this kind of thing, and try and persuade people to talk to me. And it seemed that was very different from the kind of training that academic historians got. And I wondered, do you feel that the biographer, you're a bit more kind of out in the world than the traditional literary academic? Does it require a different set of skills?
Who is it who says that academics are just journalists who are getting their copy in 300 years late?
Yeah, or something
so
like that.
You're drawing a distinction between journalists and biographers, and between academics.
Which is biography closer to, do you think?
Well, I think that as people have said, I mean, I think biography is a very peculiar form, because there are some people like me who have had academic careers and are also literary biographers, and that's a little bit different from biographers like, say, Michael Holroyd or Claire Tomlin or Victoria Glendinning, who haven't gone anywhere near academic careers.
I was reading, is it Robert Massey in the US, who wrote these huge doorstopper histories of the naval First World War, but I think he was a biographer of the Romanovs, possibly first. Mm-hmm. He'd be pretty old now. But yeah, are they multiple tracks that...
Well, I think that it's complicated. So yes, to answer your first question, I think that there is a link between biography and journalism. But what you don't want to be doing as a biographer, to put journalism at its low level, is simply to be using the clippings and following the gossip. There has to be more to it than that, and it has to be a more serious and inward enterprise than that. I think there is a relationship between biography and academic work. For instance, my husband has done a lot of literary editing, for instance, editing of Keats, and when he's talking about trying to pursue a particular fact for an editorial point of view, from an editorial point of view about the life of Keats, I recognise what he's doing. It is not a million miles away from what I'm doing when I'm trying to hunt up something about Edith Wharton. Biographers couldn't exist without the people who've edited the texts, actually. We're very dependent on that. So there's a standoff also between biographers and historians, because historians often feel that biographies are, too individualistic and doesn't take account of the great forces. So I think biography stands in a weird overlapping relationship with journalism, with historians, with academic critics. It partakes of some of the characteristics of all those things, but it isn't quite like any of them. And if it's too like any of them, it's going to be either it's going to be too boring and fact heavy, or it's going to be too light and sensationalist. And you've got to be careful, I think.
And in your career, how did you end up writing these kind of general or books that were aimed at a broader audience? How with the mechanics of dealing with publishers, and did they come to you or did you go to them? How did these projects come about?
Well, I think I got into biography, as I was sort of saying earlier on, partly because I didn't feel very at home with what was happening with literary criticism in the 1970s, 1980s, and I suppose in a way biography was a sort of retreat from that for me, or an escape for me from that. I was asked to, for instance, by publishers to do the life of Virginia Woolf, for instance, in the 90s. I was asked by one publisher to write a new biography of Virginia Woolf. The previous one had been by her nephew Quentin Bell, and it had been, quite a long time ago. And I said no. Actually, I thought it was a ridiculous idea. There was so much on Virginia Woolf. And then
how many biographies were there by that stage?
Oh, I can't count, but several.
Yeah.
But his was seen quite rightly to be the definitive one.
Do you use the word definitive?
No, I don't like the word definitive.
We had Max Hastings on the programme, and he was very anti.
No, I don't like the but in terms of perception, it was seen as a definitive one. And then another publisher asked me to do it, and I thought, oh well, there's something going on here. It's the early 90s. People clearly think it's time for another one. Quentin's came out in the early 80s, late 70s. So I thought, it would be timid to say no. Yeah. But I was very nervous of the enterprise, and you have to get over that nervousness and fear of the subject if it's a big thing.
What were you afraid of?
Well, I was afraid of her, because she's so extraordinary, she's so intelligent, she's so unlike any other human being, and also there are lots of problems with her too. Yeah. And I was afraid of the myth around her, which is a sort of myth that grows up around, I have to say, women writers who commit suicide, for instance, or romantic male writers who die early. I mean, there's a sort of Shelley myth, there's a Sylvia Plath myth, there's a Virginia Woolf myth.
Chatterton, all that kind of
thing, right? Yeah. And that you have to take on board and think about it. There'd also been a lot of different lines of thought about her since 1941 when she died. And I needed to take those on board as well, the ways in which she had been perceived, and she goes on changing. I mean, Virginia was one of those writers who goes on changing for every generation. Yeah. So, yes, I did it because I was asked to do it. Actually,
by which publisher?
By Cather.
Okay.
Who have been my publishers for a long time.
And how did the experience of doing that compare to your preconceptions, your anxieties about doing it? What was taking on the project, doing a biography for the first time? What was it like?
It wasn't the first time I'd written in a biographical way about a writer, so I had a sense of how that interested me and how that might be done. I decided very early on with that book that it was very much about structure.
Okay.
Because Virginia Woolf herself was so critical of and so wary of the form of biography, she was very interested in it, but she always felt it was hopeless, that it left out what really mattered, that biography could never somehow properly get to terms with the inner as well as the social life of the person. Although she lapped them up herself, she read lots of biography. And because of that, and because she herself was such a formalist and so interested in inventing new forms for her subjects, I decided to follow her lead, to take a clue from her. And so I structured it not as a completely straightforwardly chronological birth, middle life, end, death. I structured it very much in terms of themes or areas of her life, and I tried to play that against the chronology. I mean, the chronology has to be there.
And were your publishers happy with that?
Well, they sort of took it, yeah. And I think, looking back, I mean, it came out in 96, which is a very long time ago. But I think I don't attribute this to my book, but I think since then there has been a lot more freedom in the way that people choose to shape the telling of a life. Because any way you choose to shape it is is artificial. I actually took my clue from something that she says when she's talking about how she's going to write Mrs. Dalloway. So Mrs. Dalloway is a novel in which people are going along their gridded lives, and the clocks are striking, and they've got to get to certain things and they go through London on this one day, and within that time zone of real time, they're going all over the place in terms of memory and thinking about relationships and thinking about death and mortality,
and the war and
all of that, which is buried just under the surface, but very much there. And she says, how am I going to do this? She says, it's going to be really difficult. I'm going to dig out caves behind my characters. I'm going to sort of hollow out a space behind them. And I thought about that a lot. I thought, that's just what I want to do. I want to show her living her life, but I want to keep hollowing out spaces so that I would have a whole chapter on reading, for instance, or a whole chapter on friendships, or a whole chapter on illness, and then pick the plot up again. And many was the time when I was doing it, I thought, why did I set myself to do it like this? It would have been so much easier just to say, and then the following week she had tea with Vita Sackville West again.
How long did it take?
5 years.
Okay.
I took 3 years unpaid leave from York while I was doing it.
And were there still witnesses?
But biographies always take a long time.
Were there still people who knew her alive?
Yes, I just was lucky. I just caught the end of that generation. I mean, Quentin and Olivia, who just died, Olivia Bell, who died at 102, they were very much there. Francis Partridge, Stephen Spender, quite a lot of figures in that world. And so I went to see all these people, and they had been telling their stories about Virginia Woolf for the last 50 years, all of which were written down as well. People like Isaiah Berlin. And, I just knew that when I walked out the door, they were picking up the phone to each other. Oh, there's another one. And in a way, it wasn't so much what they were going to tell you, because you knew what they were going to tell you.
Yeah.
It was the tone. It was getting a sense of that period feel. And also I learnt doing those interviews what you must never say. So I would go and see some venerable old ladies,
right,
and they would say, she killed herself, my dear. and I learnt never to say, yes, I know.
Oh, really?
If you say, yes, I know, in an interview, it completely shuts the conversation down. The person thinks, well, why has she bothered to come and see me then if she already knows everything?
What is that old trick borrowed from therapy, just not asking questions, of just making statements?
You can't do that. You have to. It's very interesting, the whole thing about witness testimony. I'm very fascinated by this. Because I'm working on a living person at the moment, and my previous book was about someone whose family had asked me to write. It was the life of Penelope Fitzgerald, and so everyone was alive, and I went to see everyone. And, witness testimony about someone they've known, especially if they're very fond of them or very close to them, is a very complicated matter.
I mean, I'm very conscious, again, I suppose from what I've been writing about, that I think it must be different with biography, but I think a lot of it depends ultimately as to whether it's a good story or a bad story, whether it's a success or a failure. And so my experience, if you're writing about an issue that went well, it was everyone's idea. If you were writing about something that went badly, it was all someone else's fault. And that I've found utterly extraordinary in the process.
This is a very different job from what I've been doing, because I haven't written the really demanding kinds of biography, which is, the biography of Stalin or Hitler or Nero or something. I'm a literary writer. I come out of literary criticism and teaching literature. I've only ever written, and would only ever write, about people whose work I admire and think is worthwhile.
Well, I was going to ask, do you see literary biography as a fundamentally different form than other biography?
Well, no, in the sense that if you're writing a life of Matisse or Edmund Hillary or Gertrude Jekyll, you've got to know about the work in the same sort of way, and you've got to think about the relationship between the work and the life in the same sort of way. But literary biography, obviously, you have the advantage that they are vocal and that they've turned parts of their life into their writing, and so in a way you have this amazing opportunity to think about how the life relates to the work, and also you're hoping that what you're doing is going to help to understand the work and to see why it was written. I mean, that's sort of part of the point. So I think it has its own particular qualities, but I haven't done that thing that you were saying of talking about someone whose life has been a car crash, or someone who's been a catastrophically bad person in terms of the and I can see that would
it's
take
the frame
different things. Though the Penelope Fitzgerald is a very interesting case in point, because her life for many years was a complete
messy,
disaster.
Right? She was homeless and things like that.
Absolute disaster and a real struggle. And it's very, very interesting to think about someone who came out of a privileged, middle class, rather genteel, professional, intellectual background, plummeted down through those nets of middle class life into serious poverty, and then came out of it after many, many years, late starter, around 60 when she got going, and became famous at 80. So it's a hopeful story in a way.
I mean, when you talk about literary biography, I immediately thought of the John le Carré biography, Adam Sismon's one that came out a few years ago, which almost entirely avoided any discussion of the texts. There wasn't really any. There was a review that I read saying, le Carré's entire literary career has been getting people to take him seriously as a novelist, and now that's sort of happened, and yet there's nothing. It dodged the spying bit because he wouldn't talk about it, and it didn't engage with the texts that much. Is that just because when you're the first one, when they're still alive, it's all too difficult and too...
I guess it's a choice. I mean, it's a big, complicated, very active, dramatic life. So I suppose that Adam Sismon decided that, given he had a word limit, he needed to concentrate on the events of the life. I mean, I come at it in a different way. I mean, for me, writing about the work is as important as writing about the life. So all my books, for good or ill, have got a lot in them about the writer's work. I can't see the point otherwise, because that's kind of why I've come to it.
Yeah.
So it's a choice, I remember Claire Tomlin did a nice life of Catherine Mansfield a long time ago, but she made the choice that she wasn't going to write about the work. And I remember reading it and thinking, well, I love this story, but I'm really frustrated because I would love to know what she had to say about the work. But that's me.
I mean, the other example that comes to mind thinking about that is Hemingway's Boat. Do you know this book that came out so Hemingway had 7 full-length, doorstopper biographies. That Carlos Baker did the first life in the 60s. There'd been the obligatory, highly psychoanalytical one. There would be everything had been done. And then this American writer, I can't remember his name, but he thought, I'm going to write about Hemingway by writing about Pilar, by writing about the cabin cruiser that he bought when A Farewell to Arms was published, when he first had money and everything like that. And it's the story. It's not a big book. It's a slim book, very highly praised in the US. And I thought, because certainly for me, the prospect of wading in as biographer number 8 or something like that would be just,
I think it's interesting. I think there's a very, very different feeling about the operation if you're coming in if you've chosen to write a life of someone who has been much written about, or if you are asked or have chosen to write, as it were, what is the very first one or nearly the first one. And I've had both experiences. So it was clear to me that when I was writing about Edith Wharton and Virginia Woolf that I wanted to write, I think all biography is reactive actually, but I wanted to write the biography I thought was needed then, i.e. the one that I hadn't read. I couldn't find it, therefore I wrote it, as it were. So the one about Virginia Woolf was written clearly in reaction to a line of thought about her, which in my view somewhat infantilized her, which was very much about illness and was very much about childhood abuse and wanted to read all the life and all the work in terms of the kind of damage that had, that there was in her life. And I wanted to read her as a fantastically professional, active, strong, politically interested, involved with the world. I didn't want to keep her in the cradle, as it were, in that way. And with Wharton, it was very clear to me what I wanted to do, which was that she was entirely American oriented. Obviously, she writes about America all the time. And the prize-winning R.W.B. Lewis book was really massively focused on the American life.
When
and
had that
American
been published?
connections. That was published in the 50s, I think, 60s. And I just wanted to write the European Edith Wharton.
Yeah.
This is a woman who is in love with France, dedicates her life to France in the First World War, lives and dies there.
Can we talk about the chapter you sent me? So this is a chapter, the Henry James chapter, which were these fascinating accounts of sort of 1906 motoring around France.
Yes, in the Panhard Levasseur.
Yeah, but could you tell me a bit about process? How is that pulled together? Where is that material coming from? And I suppose the other question about the use of narrative. What are your feelings about that? But maybe on just the mechanics of pulling that chapter about things together.
So that's a chapter called The Legend, which is about Wharton's friendship and literary relationship with Henry James, within a big biography of Wharton. What I wanted to do, by the way, with that biography was to make it like a sort of series of richly furnished rooms, because she was such a material girl and she was so rich and so involved in possessions and decoration of houses and building her own houses and gardens. So I wanted each room to be like the sort of big, well-furnished room you were going to. So this was the Henry James room. I was also very aware that there isn't I can't think of a single book about Edith Wharton or a single essay on Edith Wharton that doesn't at some point compare her with James.
Yeah.
And she got very impatient with this when she started publishing and being well known. One of her friends wrote to her and said, "Have you noticed you were referred to the other day as the masculine Henry James?"
Okay.
Which I thought was very funny. So I wanted to describe the fact that when she started out, he was the big name, he was the
what was the age gap?
It's about 20 years. And he was the world famous legendary writer, and she was very shy of him. And then she made her name and made a fortune. She already had.
She bought this car from her.
With a House of Mirth, 1905.
And what is it? So
huge success. So this is just at the time when he's having a terrible time with the republication of his work in the New York edition. It's a terrible failure. He doesn't make any money, and somebody says, somebody tells this story. She says, with the proceeds of my last book, I bought this car.
And he says he bought a wheelbarrow.
Henry James says, with the proceeds of my last book, I bought a wheelbarrow, which I wheel my guests' luggage from the station to my house. With the proceeds of my next book, I shall have it painted. And he did feel that. He did feel that she was this kind of rather brash, big public figure. And she felt very impatient with the late Henry James style, the convoluted, involuted indirectness of it. She didn't like it. So broadly speaking, I think the difference between them was that she was a much bolder, more direct, more cutting, more satirical writer.
And was that primary source or secondary source? Where were the
where did I get all the material?
Where did the material all come from?
Oh, well, I pieced it all together. It's like a great big mosaic. So a lot of it comes from reading books about James.
Yeah.
A lot of it comes from looking at letters. A lot of it comes from anecdotes which are published in all kinds of scattered places. So you piece it together, and one of the peculiarities of biography, and the Wharton books are a good example of that, is she knew 1 million people. So how far do you go? Do you go into the lives of all these other people?
Yeah, where do you stop? Right?
Where do you stop? Yeah. It's very difficult. And one of the things that's very interesting, and you will know this too, is that very often the best source is not when people are writing to each other or writing directly about someone, but when you go one step sideways. Yeah. So I found some fascinating material about her in the archive of Bernard Berenson's villa in Italy, Itati, where there are shoeboxes of files of all the people that Berenson knew, and they're often writing to each other, and she will come up because she was often there, and you'll get someone saying something about her. And of course people say things about other people that they wouldn't say to them.
Yeah. How do you organise your research materials? Do you have a secret method?
If it was secret, I wouldn't tell you. Lots of different ways. A lot of it's on the computer. Yeah. A lot of it isn't. A lot of it is photocopies of materials I've been sent or have found. notebooks, actually. I keep a lot of notebooks, and I just have to try and remember where all these different things are.
And what also sprung to mind when I was reading that is, do you know the Anthony Burgess novel Earthly Powers? Which
yes.
There's the sort of fictionalised retelling of the life of Somerset Maugham, which has a Henry James cameo in him kind of pitching up around.
It's very interesting that I think I had a great admiration for Anthony Burgess. I overlapped with him reviewing on the pages of The Observer, and there were all kinds of amazing stories about how people would send him the wrong book for review, and then they'd send an apology saying, "I'm sorry, I sent you the wrong book. I meant to send you this one." By which time he would have sent the review of the wrong book already, by return. He was an amazing phenomenon.
Living in a camper van in Monte Carlo or something at the time.
But I think fictional versions of real people, both in plays and novels, are very illuminating and interesting.
Okay, and what about narrative? As a do you write as narrative usually, or what's your thoughts about doing that?
I think it's incredibly important to tell a story that people will be wanting to follow and will become hooked on. So I want to. I couldn't ever write fiction, but I want my biographies to have a sort of storytelling power, if possible.
And we always ask every guest we have about money and how it fits with their writing lives. Have you? I mean, you've been employed in academic jobs throughout your career. Have you made appreciable sums from your writing? Do you
know? No. I mean, a case in point is the Virginia Woolf biography, which I took 3 years unpaid leave from my academic job in York in order to get it done. Otherwise, I would never have got it done. So I lived off my advance. So that was my income for those 3 years. So it's taken me a very, very long time to earn back anything from the royalties. I mean, I'm proud to say that I still do, and that small royalties arrive periodically from that book, but they wouldn't be enough to
but you got a sizable advance.
That was the era of quite big advances. It's gone that really now. Publishers are not, for obvious reasons, paying out large advances for big biographies.
Although they do sell, right? In
yes, they do. I mean, a life of Penelope Fitzgerald is not going to sell like a life of Mick Jagger. I mean, I write about people who are, this is not a huge audience that is interested in Penelope Fitzgerald or Edith Wharton or Willa Cather. They're people like me, they're readers who have particular literary interests. This is not a great big wide audience. So, but because I've been very lucky and I've had a regular income, that's an indulgence I can allow myself. To spend a long time writing on a figure, a book about whom is not going to sell in huge numbers.
Would you do someone who is alive?
Yes, I am at the moment writing a biography of Tom Stoppard.
Okay, and how did that? Were you approached by them, or?
Yes, I was asked.
Okay, and how is this the first time you've done a living subject?
Yes, though Penelope Fitzgerald was someone I knew and had interviewed, and her older daughter and her husband, who were the executors, came and asked me to do it. So that was quite a close connection.
I mean, there are innumerable examples of these relationships going terribly wrong, right? When you're asked to come and write about someone who's living or things like that. How do you navigate those waters?
There's a very interesting story about Samuel Beckett saying to his first, I think she was his first biographer, Deirdre Bear, Beckett, rather Beckettianly, said to her, "I will neither help nor hinder." And that's a wonderful example of the sort of, that kind of the edginess of the relationship. Well, you just have to hope for the best.
Because I was reading, I think, about Jan Wenner, the publisher of Rolling Stone, who had an authorised biographer, and they fell out spectacularly at some point. And what's the relationship? Do they have copy approval, to use a very journalistic term? Or?
There's an interesting book by Ian Hamilton, which is an example of the falling out that you're describing.
You mentioned this with Nadine Gordimer, right? This
is a different story. So Ian Hamilton was going to set out to write a life of Salinger, which is quite a challenging thing to do,
Yeah.
because Salinger was probably one of the most reclusive and self-protected writers there's ever been.
Up with Pynchon and
Yeah. Maybe even more so, I don't know. Doesn't stop you being written about, of course.
No.
And Salinger read the typescript or maybe even didn't read it but heard about it, and took Ian Hamilton and the publishers to court and stopped the book. And then Hamilton wrote a brilliant book in many ways. I mean, it wasn't the book you wanted to read. You wanted to read Hamilton's Life of Salinger. But what he wrote was a book called In Search of J.D. Salinger,
right.
which was about the whole problem. And so the case in point became the subject of the book, which is a fascinating example. The other one you're talking about is that Nadine Gordimer, of blessed memory, commissioned a biography from a guy called Suresh Roberts. I think that's right. And she didn't like it.
Okay.
It had a lot of quite revealing and critical material about her. And she withdrew her authorization from it, having tried to ask him to take things out. And the English and the UK and USA publishers then, I'm trying to get the story right, then said, okay, well, we're not going to publish it because it's not authorised. And so he had a South African publisher publish it. He was, I think, South African. And then they shipped copies abroad so one could read it anyway. And within the book, he then put in a lot of material about her critiques of what he'd done, and I must say made a very sort of fierce point about the fact that she herself had been so opposed to apartheid and to the kind of censorship of work that went along with apartheid. But here she was trying to censor him, at which point Nadine Gordimer held a dignified silence, in the hopes, I imagine, that her work would outlive his.
Well, that seems an excellent note on which to end. Thank you for being such a gracious and candid guest.
No, thank you. It's really interesting to have this conversation.
Thank you very much indeed. Hello, it's us again. I'll give the update from my life in a moment, but first of all, introducing our new co-host for the podcast, who is Eleanor Halls. Eleanor, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Thank you. Yes, so I am currently British GQ magazine's senior staff writer. I've been here for 3 years now, and I write long reads and profiles and comment across the magazine and the website. Sadly, this is actually my last month at GQ, because next month I join The Telegraph as their commissioning editor across arts and features, which is exciting.
So really exciting to have Eleanor joining us on the podcast, and you'll hear more about her in weeks to come. From my side, I've been slogging on my book, and I'm about to go to Kazakhstan to write a piece for Business Week, so usual. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Eleanor Halls.
Our producer is Nicola Keane. Zara Hankier handles our social media. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
You can find us on all manner of social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. And you can rate and subscribe and review the podcast on iTunes.
And if you feel like chipping into our crowdfunding campaign, that's at patreon.com/alwaystakeNotes.